Our presenter or speaker today is Prof Meshach Aziakpono, and the title for today's session is the challenges and the options of the economical development financing in Africa during and after COVID-19. We welcome each and every one of you. We ask that you sit back and relax and enjoy the session. Before I hand over to our facilitator today, Emma Rono, I will just quickly run through the guideline with you. And we ask that you either mute your video and your camera, or if you want to unmute your video, you are more than welcome to do that as well. And if you have any questions, we ask that you raise it in the chat box for us, post it there, and then the facilitator, Emma, will address your questions during the Q&A slot. And we say that you relax and enjoy the session, and I will hand over now to Emma Rono, who will introduce Prof Meshach Aziakpono. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning in West Africa and other parts of the world. Good afternoon in East Africa, South Africa, and other parts too. I would like to extend a warm welcome to today's webinar on the challenges and options of economic development in Africa during and after COVID-19. My name is Emma Rono, Chair of the East African Alumni Chapter, and I'll be moderating the webinar. And I'm excited for the East Africa Chapter to be hosting this session today. So the COVID pandemic has indeed presented unparalleled financial development shocks, and the social and economic crisis it has triggered will derail chances to achieve the agenda for sustainable development unless there is a provision of a corresponding global rapid response, reaching at least 10% of global GDP. Provision of support to all countries in need and building better for more resilient economies and inclusive societies. The pandemic risks create major setbacks in financing for sustainable development. Domestic resource mobilization will suffer as economic activities reduce. Inflows of external private finance are projected to drop significantly compared to 2019 levels, exceeding the impact of the 2008 global financial crisis by about 60%. Fiscal space is likely to narrow further with rising domestic spending and exchange rate movements against the dollar, that is the US dollar. Already scarce resources coupled with the economic impact of the crisis imply that developing economies might struggle to finance adequate public health and social and economic responses. No single resource of financing will be enough to close the COVID-19 financing gap. So I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Professor Meshach Aziakpono, who is a faculty member at USB. Meshach Aziakpono is a professor of development finance, and until April 2013 was the head of development finance programs at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. He obtained the degree of Bachelor of Science Honors in Economics and Statistics with a second-class Honors Upper Division in 1994 at the University of Benin, that is in Benin City, Nigeria. The degree of Master of Science in Economics in 1998 at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, and a PhD in Economics in 2008 at the University of Free State. This PhD thesis is titled The Depth of Financial Integration and its Effects on Financial Development and Economic Performance of the Southern African Customs Union countries, won the Founders Medal for the best PhD dissertation in economics in South Africa. He started his career as a research assistant at the Nigerian Institute of Social and Economic Research in Ibadan, Nigeria in 1994. He has subsequently lectured in universities in Nigeria and Lesotho. He joined the University of Stellenbosch Business School in February 2010 as a professor of development finance, and until April 2013 was the head of development finance program in the school. Prof has also worked as a consultant, among others, for the OECD Center and the African Economic Research Consortium, where he's also a network member and a resource person. In 2009, he was a visiting scholar to the IMF in Washington, DC, USA, and in 2012, a visiting scholar to the INSEAD in Singapore. In 2019, he was on sabbatical leave at the Ghana Institute of Management, Public Administration, GIMPA. He has also served as a member of Academic Board of Economic Research Southern Africa and as a peer review member of research process at University of Johannesburg, Faculty of Economics and Financial Sciences. Before I hand over to Professor Aziakpono, I have a few housekeeping issues that we need to cover. We'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question for our speaker, please feel free to send in through the chat tab at the bottom of the screen. We'll be answering questions at the end of the session. Please do also keep your microphone on mute. So without further ado, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming our speaker. Prof, over to you.
Thank you very much, Emma Rono, for the kind introduction. That's very kind of you. And I also want to welcome all the alumni to this event. And it's always a pleasure to meet some of you. Usually we meet face to face, but this time around we are meeting via Zoom. So what I want to quickly do now is to share my slides, and then I can start the presentation. Do you see the slide?
Yes.
Good, thank you very much. So what I want to look at the title, the challenges and options of economic development financing in Africa during and after COVID. As you are all well aware, the COVID has really turned our world around. I don't think anybody could have anticipated the level of disruption that we have seen in these past few months. Last year, nobody could have imagined or anticipated what we are seeing now. According to the World Bank, the WHO, as of yesterday, some 25 million people, over 25 million people have been affected by the COVID, and over 850,000 people have died. In Africa, some 1 million plus have contracted the disease, and many have also died. So you can just imagine this disease, how it has affected people all over the world. Now, what I'm going to look at in my presentation, I will quickly look at what are the development challenges in Africa before COVID-19. So it will give us a kind of a background to the challenges that we are facing before COVID compounded the situation. And then I will also talk briefly about the source of economic development financing. So here, this is more of the principle, what exactly is used to finance economic development generally. And then I will talk about the impact of COVID in Africa. Then I will look at the global and African response to the COVID-19, and then I will quickly summarize some of the options for dealing with the long-term effect of COVID-19. So on the first part, development challenges. So if you think in terms of development challenges, we are not, Africa is not in isolation. Africa is part of the global environment. And when we talk about development challenges, there are challenges that are not limited to Africa. So for instance, it is the desire of all the nations around the world to eliminate basic poverty. So poverty and hunger should be eradicated, improving health and education, providing access to affordable energy, promoting gender equality. And again, when you think in terms of national sustainable development needs, we talk about infrastructure, rural development, adaptation and climate resilient development, and energy. These are all needs that around the world are seen as needs that need to be met. Again, we also have global public goods such as the protection of the global environment and combating combating climate change and its impact. I think let me put the presentation on presentation mode. All right. So when we look at the context of Africa, specifically, as we all are aware, African countries are very poor. That is a fact in terms of resources when compared to other countries in the world. So how do we know that? If you look at the World Bank in 2019 gross national income per capita, if you look at countries that are regarded as low income, of the 31 of them, 23 are from Africa. And if you look at the low middle income countries, of the 47, 20 are from Africa. And if you look at upper middle income countries, of 60, only 8 are from Africa. And if you think of high income countries, only 80 of them, only 1 is from Africa. So that shows where most African countries are based. And if you think in terms of infrastructure and unemployment, these are very high. I will illustrate that a little bit more later. If you think in terms of the GDP per capita, so if you look at the trend, you will see where sub-Saharan Africa is the lowest of all of them. What does that mean? In other words, before COVID, in terms of resources that is available compared to other regions of the world, Africa is at the lowest level of income compared to other parts of the world. Again, we can look at poverty, headcount poverty. If you look at the trend, whereas other countries have reduced significantly in terms of income, those who live with $1.90 a day, Africa remain very high on that compared to other regions of the world. In addition to the fact that income is low, there is a high level of income inequality on the continent. So if you look at the selected African countries that are picked, Botswana, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, if you look at the income inequality, depending on the data that's available, you realize that the income inequality is very high. What does that imply? When countries' income are low and the income is highly unequal, definitely the proportion of the people that are poor are bound to agitate, and they are bound to be social unrest and social challenges. So it's not surprising that we are having these kind of challenges on the continent of Africa because of this high level of income inequality, which has been there before the COVID came. If you look at this figure that I have here, which shows the unemployment rate in emerging market economies, and 2 countries from Africa is highlighted. And if you look at the highest level of unemployment in 2019, according to the estimate from the UN study report, South Africa has the highest level of unemployment, and Nigeria follow. And if you think in terms of this unemployment, which is reported, that is the aggregate. And if you look at it from the point of view of youth unemployment, so I have the data for South Africa, where you have the OECD report in 2019, which provides the unemployment for youth. 57% of youth unemployment. And if you think in terms of long-term unemployment, so that shows the level of unemployment that exists for some of the African countries, like we've seen in the case of South Africa. What does it mean? If youth are so unemployed, and you think about the population of the world, Africa, as this graph is showing, if you look at the age distribution, majority of the population are youth. So if majority of them are youth and they are unemployed, that is the baggage we were bringing before COVID came into effect. So if you look at this picture we are having, over 70% of the population on the continent of sub-Saharan Africa are youth below, from 29 and below. Whereas only about 30% of the population are above 30 years old. that shows that if the youth are unemployed and there are no jobs for the youth, definitely there's a crisis. Again, we talk about infrastructure. I'm not going to talk too much about this. According to African Development Bank estimate of the resources that need to be committed to infrastructure development in Africa, it's estimated that $100 billion annually is required to be able to meet up the gap in the next 10 years in terms of infrastructure development. So roads, if you look at electricity, other transport infrastructure, water, and so on and so forth, you realize that a lot of investment is required for Africa. Then, when we think in terms of how then do we finance all these economic development challenges that we talk about, which I did not exhaust in this brief presentation that I've mentioned, we have a number of sources of financing economic development. Normally, we can group them into 4 categories. So the 4 of them, we can look at it from the point of view of domestic public finance, so this one, and then the domestic private finance. We can also look at international public finance and international private finance. And when we talk of international, domestic public finance, we are looking here at tax revenues, revenue from natural resources. So if you have natural resources like oil, like gold, the royalty that the government generates, and from the export of such natural resources, the resources that accrue to the government, that's part of domestic resources that is available for public finance. And then the public sector could also borrow to finance its activity, both domestically or from external sources. When we talk in terms of domestic private finance, here we are looking at the role of the financial sector. So the banking sector often dominates. Then we have the domestic savings, the domestic bond market, and institutional investors like the insurance company, the pension fund. They all form all the sources of resources that are available from a private sector point of view domestically. Then we have international public finance. When we talk about international public finance here, we are looking at external debt, official development assistance, multilateral climate finance, climate investment fund, green climate fund. All of this constitute international public finance. And then we can also talk in terms of international private finance. Here we look at things like FDI, international portfolio investment, remittances, and all the philanthropic finance or aid that are given from individuals across the border. Why not spending much time on this? A key point that I want to highlight here is that in Africa, most developing countries and in Africa, one of the key challenges with domestic public finance is that there is a significant weak institutions, which then make it possible for a high level of tax evasion and avoidance, which then limit the ability of the state to mobilize resources using tax. And in terms of how resources are used, there is also a significant level of subsidy that is given. If you look at the estimate which the United Nations provided in 2014, it was estimated that in terms of both pre-tax and post-tax subsidy, post-tax, for instance, was about 1.9 trillion US dollar for subsidy alone. When you think in terms of this magnitude of resources being used for subsidies, while there may be need for it, but it shows the burden that in terms of resources that are used in a way that is not contributing to productivity in the state, in most of the country. Another point is government debt. So government is to be borrowing for most of the time to finance both domestically and externally. And if you look at the debt statistics according to the IMF in terms of percentage of GDP in 2008 and 2019, this is a picture. So for some of these countries, we have here in Nigeria, we have South Africa. If you look at some of these countries, the debt burden is already very high. And some studies have shown that a threshold of about 60%, 67% would be a maximum threshold when debt will stop producing a positive impact. And if you move beyond that level, it will begin to have significant negative impact on the economy, which could be very high in terms of the impact. In terms of domestic private finance, one of the things that I want to highlight here is the fact that before COVID, if you look at the deposit that is mobilized by the private by banks, which is then can be used to finance the economy, you realize that for most developing countries, for most African countries, the level of deposit mobilized is still very low. So if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, which is highlighted red here, you will see that of the total GDP in 2015, only 21% of it is mobilized in terms of deposit by banks. And you can see how low it is for most other countries compared to Euro area and the world average, which is far higher than the Sub-Saharan African countries. What about domestic credit? Again, you will see the low level of credit that is advanced to the private sector in the economy, which if the banking sector cannot finance the economy, that shows how weak the financial sector is in providing finance for the economy. So when you look at domestic private finance, what I'm trying to highlight here is the limitations of the existing institutions that we have, the banks and other funding institutions that are available. Now, when we talk in terms of international public finance, we have the ODA, like I mentioned. Let me skip that and move to the private aspect of it, where we look at remittances, foreign direct investment, which has become important that we need to attract to complement the domestic resources. This is very, very important. But the reality is that, again, the flow of this depends on so many factors, which are not, I'm not able to go into now, but these are growing, but not at a pace that is sufficient to meet the need of the continent at the moment. Now, when we talk in terms of COVID, so that is the picture that was there before COVID came in. Gross inadequacy of domestic resources. Whereas a lot of effort has been made in recent years to increase domestic mobilization, institutions are being improved, but where we are still far behind in terms of resources that are needed to develop or to finance economic development on the continent. How then does COVID impact on Africa? So if you think in terms of when the pandemic started, the first thing that happened as a way of trying to prevent the spread, the transmission of the COVID, the first thing that was done is to shut down the economy. So many countries, the streets that were booming before were shut down. And that meant that economic activity was slowed down. As a result of this slowdown of economic activities, many economies are projected to go into recession. And to help us to appreciate this impact over time, we look at a study documented the historical number of countries that have entered recession at different times in history. And if you think in terms of the period when during the 1930 global recession, the Great Recession of the past, which many who experienced it are very old now, if you look at it, that was a time where over 80 countries experienced recession at a point in time. And if you look at after that time, even during the recent global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, over 60 countries, just about 60 countries experienced a recession. But when we talk about the current pandemic, and the expectation is that close to 100 countries between 2020 and 2021 will enter recession. So in other words, we are experiencing something that has never experienced before in terms of scale of economic effect of anything. So even the global, the world wars, the First World War, the Second World War, the Great Depression, the effect that those kind of events had on the world in terms of economic disruption cannot be compared to this global pandemic. So that shows the scale. And as a result of that, many countries are affected. So how is the event happening? So it started with a pandemic, the COVID, then it will transmit to economic crisis, which recession that we have highlighted. And the implication of a recession is that it will get to a global financial crisis. And with a crisis, a financial crisis, it will also feed into economic activity. So this is the reality that the world is facing today. So if we are facing that reality, how then do we address it? But before we look at how we will address it, the question is, how does it impact Africa? So in terms of the impact on Africa, we will quickly look at two impacts. One of the study by the African Union identified two possible channel of impact. The exogenous impact, those are impact that are coming from external, and one of them is the decline in tourism. Of course, this is not exhaustive. The decline in remittances from African diaspora, then foreign direct investment as a critical source of financial development financing. Official development assistance would also fall. And when we think in terms of falling oil prices and commodity prices that have been affected because of the global pandemic, it also means that even the sources of domestic public finance as a source of finance will be impacted significantly. On the other hand, there are also domestic domestic effects. For instance, the disruption of economic activities, which was brought about by this. As a result of this significant disruption, businesses shutting down and economic activity reducing, we would expect a significant drop in tax revenue going forward. Then there's also going to be a loss, just a second, there will be a loss in revenue due to fall in oil and commodity prices. Then there will be increase in public expenditure. So as a way of trying to solve the problem, there's going to be, we have seen that already happening, adjustment to expenditure has been made, and further reallocation of the budget has been made to try to address the needs of the COVID. But in addition to that, it's going to be need to further invest in the economy. The reason being that if you think in terms of other crises, whereas somebody can be blamed, like the global financial crisis that happened, whereas it is easy to blame the financial sector as the major culprit for the cause of that crisis, in this particular case, it's a disease and a virus that caused this problem. Now, we can't blame that virus. Even if anybody were to blame China where it originated, it could have originated from any part of the world. And because the world is linked, it affects everybody, which then speaks to economic activity. So at this point in time, since everybody is affected, somebody had to help. And the government would have to step up to finance, provide increase in expenditure to try to cater for this. There's also a decline in export, and the financial sector would also be affected significantly in several ways. Now, when we think in terms of, I just want to highlight the debt, like I mentioned before. So many of these countries already have had a very high level of debt to GDP ratio, meaning that the fiscal space that is available to them is significantly limited. And when you just look at the case of South Africa, where it was estimated that in May, according to the Daily Maverick, that we expect 85 billion estimated loss in revenue, and some 95 billion external loan in response to COVID. Now, if you think in terms of this requirement, that will automatically increase the ratio of government borrowing to GDP. And it will soon get to a point where it will not be easy for government to borrow at a reduced cost anymore. And as the debt built up with low taxes that is them, it will become a problem going forward, even for the government to continue to sustain itself. So what does that mean? So businesses, private sector is already affected significantly, so their capacity has been constrained. Now, the only agency, the only body that is available to provide financing, to provide the support to boost the economy, to stimulate the economy is the government. But the capacity of the government is also going to be limited. So the question is, how then do you address this problem where there's a vicious cycle? So now, if we then have a financial crisis, who will bail out the financial industry, the bank, the institutions in the financial industry, to be able to continue to stimulate the economy? Those are the challenges that we will be facing going forward. Reduce tax, loss of revenue, but the need to massively stimulate the economy by increasing expenditure. And what will be the source of those funding? Borrowing will not be easy because the government is already at the initial stage, has almost reached the full capacity of borrowing. I mean, their fiscal space is already being exhausted. So if that is the case, how will this be financed? Well, in terms of the remittances, which is one of the options that we talk about, that is the flow of resources, we said it's going to be reduced. And it's interesting why this is very important. It has been one of the most steady source of flow to developing countries and also Africa. And for many African countries, this has helped to cushion the limited space of the government to provide social security for the population. So now, if you think in terms of what is happening now, according to this study, it shows that 75% of the world's migrant work in countries where 3/4 of the globe's COVID cases have been reported. So in other words, where most migrant workers are is where COVID has been most significant. And that 90% of global remittances are sent by migrants from this country. As a result of that, a significant drop in global remittances will be up to 110 billion. So you can just imagine a drop in that amount of flows to developing country, what impact it will have in their economic development finance, both at a private level and for investment within the country. So now, what was the global response and African response to the pandemic? Well, globally, as we are all aware, as soon as the pandemic started, relief packages and stimulus packages were embarked on. So we can typically look at it from a point of view of fiscal support that took place. And then we also have a monetary policy and then financial setup policies that have been embarked on as a way of easing the effect of the global pandemic. So when we talk about fiscal support, in the development of the G20 alone, over $10 trillion has been spent on this stimulating the economy. And that has been in terms of the healthcare sector, trying to provide the support, the infrastructure that is needed to be able to help the economy to be able to cushion the spread and also to be able to treat those already affected. Then there were fiscal support in terms of individuals and households. So many who lost their jobs, in order to ensure that the livelihood is maintained, many governments, especially in the G20, in the developed world, provide support for their citizens in form of unemployment grant and so on. And there were also businesses that were supported. So the businesses like SMME in different forms of support, both direct payment and others in form of what we call below the line support, where grant relief in terms of tax delay, in terms of tax payment. All of these were made to try to cushion the effect on the businesses. And even big businesses that were seen as systemic important are also provided such support. So with all of this, it has to some extent stabilized, mitigated the adverse effect or economic effect of the pandemic. In addition to the fiscal support, there were monetary policy support. So if you think in terms of what has happened across the world, of course, for many developed world, when they approached the global pandemic, the interest rate were already very low compared to what was happening before the global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. So as at the time the global pandemic came, government also, through their central bank, reduced the policy rate, which make lending cheaper, which also helped to alleviate the plight of businesses. So interest rate reduction in the G20 advanced country, about 133 basis points, and for the other emerging market within the G20, some 151 basis point reduction in interest rate were implemented. In addition to interest rate reduction, the central banks of this country also embark on open market operation, which help to ease liquidity of the financial sector, so that instead of running dry on liquidity with the purchase of assets, it makes it easier for the financial sector, the banks in particular, to have adequate liquidity to continue to provide lending during that period of time. There were also foreign exchange market intervention that helped, especially for emerging market where there was a significant outflow of capital, where investors were running to safety, which then mean that the currency was depreciating. So some of the government also intervened to try to stabilize the currency for those countries. In addition to this, there were also financial policies, financial sector policies. So when we talk in terms of financial sector policies, we have credit guarantee scheme. I know in South Africa, for instance, some 200 billion rand were committed to guarantee, which had to cushion the risk exposure of commercial banks. So instead of commercial bank lending in this difficult time where they absorb all the risk, this guarantee make it easier for them to share risk with the government in terms of providing the lending. Of course, what would have happened is a situation where there will be credit crunch, where banks will not lend because the risk level is too much, which will have further worsened the economic situation without such financing being provided. There were also supervisory support for loan restructuring, where banks were allowed to delay the repayment of their client, which will make it easier for clients to be able to absorb the effect of the economic slowdown during the pandemic. And there were also regulatory support for banks to use available capital and liquidity buffers to support lending. All of these were used to help the economy. What about developing countries? Well, part of the initiative that developing countries, the developed countries use, are similar to what developing countries in Africa also follow, except that the magnitude was quite significantly lower than it is in the developed world. Again, in terms of the reach of how many people can be supported, there is also a significant limit in terms of developing country compared to the development. So there were significant fiscal support for healthcare, individuals and households and businesses. I think one of the key problems that when it comes to this kind of support in developing country is that because there's a significant large informal sector with undocumented individuals and businesses, it's difficult to transfer this fiscal support to these individuals. I think somebody is, could we please mute our microphone so that there is no interference? There's somebody that is, I think Jemima if you could mute your microphone and others, that would be helpful. Thank you. So there's also this support, but like I was trying to explain, the fact that there's a significant informal sector in the economy where many people before the COVID have no access to the financial sector, and the businesses are not registered, and they do not have identity that will make it easy for them to access this provision, make support very difficult in most African countries. Again, in terms of the intervention, monetary policy intervention, there were reduction in the official rates were reduced. Open market operations were also a back-on, but it varied from one country to the other. Financial policy too, credit guarantees, supervisory support for loan restructuring, all of these initiatives were also adopted, but at a various degree in Africa, from country to country in terms of the magnitude and extent of the adoption of them. So when we talk in terms of going forward, what are the issues that we need to pay attention to? First, as it is evident from what I have explained in terms of the capacity to generate domestic resources, it is very limited. What has happened with COVID is to worsen this situation. So if you think in terms of GDP per capita that was very low, with the low productivity that has taken place with COVID and with the economic recession, and if it continues into a financial crisis, which will further fuel a recession that will continue, if that continues, it means that the GDP per capita will reduce. And when we talk about poverty, poverty will then increase. So the ability of the government to be able to generate resources domestically, either be through taxation, will be very limited. Again, we have seen what has happened to even commodity prices, including oil, how the prices have reduced. Again, looking forward, we do not expect a situation where there is going to be a significant increase in this price, especially oil prices for countries that depend on oil like Nigeria and many other oil-dependent countries, where they will generate a significant amount of revenue as they used to do before, after the crisis. That will be a challenge going forward. Again, when we think in terms of other sources of revenue flows, remittances, we have highlighted the challenges. As long as the developed world continue to bear the brunt of the global pandemic in terms of the economic fallout, many of Africa in diaspora will also struggle. Often they are employed in the most vulnerable sectors. So when there is a job loss, the first target will be the foreigners. So we will expect a significant drop in remittances. So when we put all of this together, whether remittances, FDI investment, foreign direct investment, or portfolio investment, when we think of all the sources of flow of funds to developing countries, we see a potential reduction significantly. And again, when we think in terms of government raising capital on their own through or mobilizing resources through taxation, that is going to be limited. And when it comes to borrowing, there will be a significant limitation. So what options are available for the government? My view is this. This problem is beyond an individual countries to solve alone. First, Africa has a unique opportunity at this point in time to do what? One, this is a time for us the African country to mobilize themselves. First, to look inward to see the potential that exists within the continent. And the African Free Trade Agreement that has been signed, this is an opportunity for Africa to really go into the implementation of it, to ensure that the implementation of this free trade arrangement help to unleash growth on the continent instead of depending on import from other parts of the world. As you can see in many countries countries are looking inward, while I'm not advocating inward looking, that nation become inward looking in terms of only buying or producing for the domestic economy. We need to produce for others, and we need to import, and we need to export. But I'm saying that the potential within African market is huge, and the free trade arrangement need to be implemented in full force. That will help to unleash potential for growth on the continent. Another point to make in that respect is that it is not going to be easy for Africa to compete with Asia. For instance, China or South Korea or many of the Asian countries in terms of the goods they produce, competing with them in terms of exporting to them and exporting to other countries that they also export to. So the free trade agreement in Africa will help. That is one. Two, given the fact that government already are overburdened with debt, I would strongly advocate that African countries mobilize themselves together and confront the lending institution, the multilateral lending institution, the bilateral lending institution, to secure a debt cancellation. So this is a typical situation of war, where the war have ravaged the countries are poor. The only way to help them to come out of that is some intervention. So my point is, countries in Africa should mobilize themselves together to approach the lenders and then ask for debt cancellation. That would be my first option, but in the absence of debt cancellation, let there be a moratorium in terms of a delay in the payment, and if possible, cancellation of interest in terms of the payment, which would give the African country the leeway to be able to develop. In addition to that, just like what typically happens when a disaster has occurred, developed nations come to the aid of such country. For the fact that African countries were already backward, and that there is also a significant crisis that did not come directly from them, but they are affected by it, it is also necessary for African countries to mobilize themselves to request for aid that will help to cushion the effect of this global pandemic. So if they can ask for a significant resources from the developed world to unleash, to be invested in the continent, that will help to boost the economy. In addition to that, as far as when it comes to SMME financing, the disbursement to SMME, this is the right opportunity for African countries to now embrace technology. So fintech, this is where they want to leverage on the capacity of technology, using technology to be able to provide access to finance, the easy payment system that will make business transaction easier for individuals and for businesses in the country, which will then help to stimulate the economy. I believe if Africans seize this opportunity and invest in these initiatives, it could help to significantly cushion the effect and hopefully could emerge from this pandemic and be able to make progress in the near future. But if they fail to seize this opportunity, what could happen is a situation where the effect will become prolonged, and this will be a total lost decade. Already the growth that Africa had experienced over the last decade has been punctuated. And if there's no effort to stimulate it, it could be another lost decade for Africa. So I hope that this suggestion will be part of what some of the African countries will pay attention to and implement. Thank you. I will pause here and I'll take questions.
Thank you so much, Meshach. I think we needed a longer time. You understand that we started very late because of the load shedding, and so many people have not managed to join. So we'll go straight to our questions. We have a good number of questions. I'll start with the first one. So somebody's saying, I get concerned that principles in theory you are sharing have been there for years and they're updated regularly. This addresses the quantitative challenges we face. How do we address qualitative challenges? For example, corruption. This is observed at family level and then pronounced at national and continental levels. What do you say, Prof? Or can we go to another question?
Yes, you can ask maybe some, then I will take the two.
Okay, so that is about corruption, for example. So the next one is, how do you think countries in Africa can change current levels, low levels of domestic investment and be able to access domestic credit? Okay.
Okay, yeah. I think let me take this two.
Okay, then we move to another set.
Yeah, so on the first question, I agree with you that the theories, we know them, but there are certain challenges that we face that is hindering it. And if you think in terms of what is going on now, you realize that they report the news and the level of corruption, even when the government is squeezing itself to provide intervention to help the vulnerable one. The successful, the already rich one are taking advantage to enrich themselves further by way of corruption, by stealing this fund. It's very sad to see that. One problem, again, is I have always been telling students and telling people that when you have a situation where it will be disbursed within a very short time, there are bound to be mistakes if the institutions are not good. Of course, we know that even in the developed world, America, you hear this bad use of these resources that are not efficient. But if the institutions are in place, they will minimize this corruption. So what institutions am I looking at? That is where I'm emphasizing the role of technology. Of course, technology is designed by human, but technology can play a significant role. So blockchain technology, for instance, is helping to identify, to onboard individuals, onboard people where identity of individuals are known. It is difficult for you to fake the identity easily. So when this type of technology are brought into use, it will help to minimize this gross corruption that is taking place, which will then mean that the resources will be better utilized. On the issue of the second one, how do you provide a lending? Again, I'm settling my argument on technology. I think this is the moment that Africa need to embrace the use of technology. If you think in terms of what is going on in Asia, in China, in many of these countries, whereas the system there are not perfect, but a lot is being accomplished with the use of technology. So this is time when the countries, instead of playing hide and seek or being aloof or try to push adoption of technology away, let them embrace it wholeheartedly and see how they can support the development of technology that can help to fast track the whole both deposit mobilization, which is very low, like I have shown, and lending, onboarding small businesses and even individuals to have access to finance, which will make them to be able to expand their businesses. So without technology, it's going to be hard, because even as it is now, just imagine you try to provide lending, distancing. How would you lend? That is going to create significant opportunity for corrupt people to opportunity behavior on the part of the borrower and also on the part of the staff of the institution that are lending, where corruption will take place. So, but if there is technology, it will help to improve on that.
Thank you. So we go to another set of questions. So what do governments need to do to increase investment from international investors and reduce local corruption? Then there's another one. I would like to hear your practical thoughts on how African governments can address their development shortfalls in the midterm, especially given how the major economies in sub-Saharan Africa are teetering on the edge with foreign debt. Are compulsory national saving schemes an option for sub-Saharan Africa? Okay, so you can answer those two, Prof.
Okay. So in terms of the need to raise investment from multilaterals, one point that we want to recognize is that all the investors, their profit, their motive is profit. So whatever the motive, we talk about access to market, access to resources, access to, the bottom line is that when they look at the resource that is available, when they look at the opportunity that is there, they ask the question, if I am there, will it help to improve my bottom line? The answer is yes, then I will go. So if we improve our institutions that make it difficult for our economy to be attractive, that will attract investors. So one of those institutions is institutions that protect investors' right. If an investor cannot be so sure of what would happen to his investment tomorrow, if there's any little thing, if somebody wants to seize those investment up, there's a protest, they will destroy those foreign investors, hence their rights are not protected, that will not help. And I think this is time when Africa, government and individuals need to recognize that whatever we do, as we try to attack others, we actually sending investors away. And when we do so, we are also affected because we do not, the world is no longer living in isolation. We are all working together. So to attract investors, you need to ensure that institutions are developed to protect property rights. And when we do that, that will help. Again, the issue of corruption came up in that question. Reducing corruption, putting measures in place to reduce corruption in the country will also help to attract investors. On the, so what's the second point again?
The second one was, somebody was asking, are compulsory national savings schemes an option for sub-Saharan Africa?
I think it is good. And I think I have another, probably a slight dimension to it, that we have that. So of course, we know that, like what I've demonstrated, the income level is low. But often the scheme that are used to encourage savings in the developing world often cater for the rich rather than the poor. So I am of the view that in addition to a scheme that provide incentive for the rich to save more, there should be a scheme that will provide incentive for the poor to save. So for instance, why not have a matching scheme where if you are a poor person, if you save $1, I will match it up with $1, but that saving must be for a specific purpose. So for instance, in South Africa, if you have a retirement annuity where you have additional savings, you have a tax relief, which is a kind of a matching because the government is going to pay you for saving for your future. Now, that scheme benefits the rich who have sufficient resources to save. But what about the poor? If there is such a scheme that provides a matching scheme where if you save $1, there will be additional $1 will be added to it. If you save 2, there will be another 2. That will encourage people to save. And by the time that kind of incentive are created, you will be surprised how much savings will be. So not only incentive to encourage the rich, like some countries are already trying to do, but such incentive should also encourage the poor, which will create a culture of saving, which with such saving, resources can then be better utilized.
Thank you so much, Meshach. I think we have so many questions, and what we are going to do is we are